Well, good afternoon and welcome to A Reason for Hope. My name is Adrian Van Vactor and I'm in studio with our pastor, one of our pastors, Sean Richards.
Good to be here. Oh, there you are. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us and happy Apologetics Monday. Today's topic, Buddhism.
Oh dear.
Yes, that's deep because Buddhism is one of the hardest to understand religions philosophically. It's been said in the past that you have to have a doctoral level of religious philosophy, of knowledge and training to even understand classical Buddhism. But, your everyday Buddhist probably doesn't understand that in depth, so we're going to cover it today anyhow, and it's going to be fast-paced because we have a lot to cover. So if you have questions about Buddhism, today's the day. But if you do have a question pertaining to the Bible, the Christian worldview, it's not related to Buddhism per se. We'll take those questions on later on in the week. But for those of you who are new, this is A Reason for Hope, a weekday Bible answer program where we take questions off the cuff from our live stream audience. And we're here for an hour, 4 to 5 p.m. every Monday through Friday, Arizona or Mountain Standard Time. So if you have a question that's been itching your mind about, like I said, the Christian worldview, the Bible, whether Christianity is reasonable, or maybe just what does this passage mean and how do I apply it to my life? Whatever it may be, whether you're a skeptic, a believer, or just someone who wants to learn more about the history of the Bible, of the Christian faith, then let us know. We're here. You can connect with us on YouTube, our YouTube channel, where we're live streaming to every weekday, is A Reason for Hope. You can go directly to our URL, just youtube.com/@a reason4hope, or search for A Reason for Hope. And if you see that red icon with the white dove, then you know you have found us. You can also catch us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, or you can go directly to there, facebook.com/CCF Tucson. You can find us there. And again, just use the comment box to ask your questions. And as long as it's sincere and Bible related or Christianity related in some way, shape, or form, then we'd be happy to take those questions. We've been doing this for several decades. So if you have a question, you think, oh, I bet you I could stump these guys. I bet you can't. I've been here long enough to know you can't. This isn't one of those places where you can actually stump the pastor. But if there is a question that we don't quite know how to respond to, we would definitely research it. We actually archive every single question that's asked. Mm-hmm. And the list is long, very, very, very long. But and if we don't get to your question today, we will get to it later on in the week. So please tune in every day. It'd be really great. We're also now live streaming to the X platform, by the way. So if you are a Twitter user, now called X, you can catch us there by following our senior pastor, Scott Richards, and his handle is ScottR4H. That's Scott with a double T. The letter R, the number 4, the letter H, and then you'll get a notification. If you're following him on the X platform, you'll get a notification every time we're live, and you can join the conversation that way. You can also catch it on our website. If you want to avoid sort of social media altogether, there are those out there who just want to not be social media people. They don't have Facebook. They might go to YouTube, but they don't want to have an account where they can have to list who they are if they want to comment. You can just create a little pseudo name. You don't have to have a social media account to comment, but if you join the live stream from our website, there is a comment box where you can ask your questions. In fact, there are times where the majority of our questions come from our website, which is great because we love people visiting our website. You can stay on top of all that's going on here at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, as well as catch all our services. We have a Wednesday evening Oasis service where we are currently going through the book of Hosea, and then our Sunday morning, 9 and 11 a.m. services. We're currently going through the book of Judges, all being live streamed to these same platforms. But we'd welcome you into our community. So if you are in the Tucson area and like to join us, feel free to come on out. Check us out and, have a good time fellowshipping with the saints. Last but not least, if you have a question and we're not on the air and you don't want to forget, or perhaps you want to be a little discreet, you can also just email us. And that email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@areason4hope.org. Today's topic, as I said, is Buddhism. And before we tackle the topic, we'll take a moment to have Pastor Sean pray for our time. Then we'll get started.
Sounds good. Dad, thank you for the honor we have to not only contend for your word, but to engage respectfully with those who would speak contrary to it. We want to ask for your grace in your heart as much as your wisdom and desire for truth, so that not only people are given a positive witness of how you've revealed yourself in history, but also to be able to spot the counterfeits that would present themselves in place of you as if it were you. We love you and we want to know you as you've revealed yourself, so equip your saints to be able to know the difference between what the world offers and who you truly are. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
That is
Well,
true.
Sean, I know you have a lot to cover, so rather than going on through my experiences in tackling folks who come from a Buddhist background, go for it.
Yeah, and there'll be time, obviously, as Adrian mentioned, when you get into a not necessarily religious, but definitely a philosophical system, things get a lot more complicated than they may seem or even need to be. And also, fortunately, when you get into complicated topics, that leaves for a lot of sticky business and wiggle room as far as what actually is being talked about. So, like what we discussed previously regarding Hinduism, which is the worldview that Buddhism came out of, it doesn't seem like the sort of topic that many Christians today would have to deal with unless you live in very specific areas of the world. Unfortunately, the ideas of Buddhism have spread to every culture, essentially, and it came from what ultimately people are failing to even understand or even recognize as Buddhism, because it's not going to put itself forward as that. When we're talking about Buddhism proper, it's not going to be something you run into very often. Even people with, all those very gaudy-looking robes and special shrines and stuff, they tend to keep to themselves. You might run into people maybe in Japan or especially Nepal who have a very unique adherence to Hinduism. But it may actually be closer than you realize, because the former member of Mythbusters, Adam Savage, and a very, very public atheist, Sam Harris, they both would describe themselves as avowed Buddhists in the term of not just their belief in Hindu philosophy, but even maintaining their atheism, how they would determine right and wrong. And I say that very tongue-in-cheek, as you're going to see in a moment. And I even hesitate to say this, but there are even liberal Christian groups, not just in the United States, but here in Tucson, where we are recording this, that would claim that Jesus was a teacher of Buddhism. They had little billboards out saying Jesus, Buddha, Christ, and so forth. So whether it's going to be the assumption that comes with it or the manipulation tactics that are used to promote it, this needs to be understood as something very real and present in the lives of Christians that we ought to be aware of, even if we don't necessarily know how to deal with every issue. We just don't want to get caught up in it. And this not only is going to require a bit of thought on our part, but it's even more important in what it doesn't require. It doesn't require a doctorate degree in philosophy to fully understand the nuances and ideas of Buddhism. Just like a, inspector, as Frank Turek and Norman Geisler noted in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. They don't need to be an expert in carpentry to notice there are termites. They don't need to be an expert in landscaping to know that doesn't look up to code, so to speak. So in the same way, we're not here to thoroughly debunk and address Buddhism at its core. We're here to give you a very introductory level of knowledge and understanding of the history of Buddhism, the problems that Christians are going to deal with Buddhism, and how to effectively address the challenges of Buddhism, meaning the ideas and the conversation hit points that you're probably going to have to maneuver around when talking to people who would describe themselves as Buddhists or that would be functioning as a Buddhist, even though they may even call themselves atheists. So starting with the history, again, Buddhism proper is not unified around exclusively that, fat golden statue or you rub the belly and you get good luck. The idea of Buddhism, however, does start with the first one who called himself by that title. And the word Buddha, again, just means an enlightened one or a form of a teacher, but what they are teaching is important. The prince, who, of course, we commonly reference in Buddhism, was born into the highest class of the Hindu culture, if you remember the caste system that we talked about briefly. He was given a life of luxury, every single need, desire, and want. He had a family. Everything was taken care of him as only a prince could be. But on top of that as well, like any family with the resources to do so, they also isolated this young man, this prince who founded Buddhism, from the world at large. And if you want more information on this, there's a book titled Buddhism, A Concise Introduction by Houston Smith and Philip Novak. I would recommend it, and given that they note their sources, I think that they give an objective opinion. The four main audiences that the prince discovered when he finally got out of the castle walls and essentially lived out the Disney princess fantasy before his perspective was changed was after never seeing such a thing. He had always had a full belly. He always had a full family. He never saw disease or want. And obviously, when he had his first exposure towards old people, well, you were kept from the rigors of age. You were only welcomed into the prince's presence if you were youthful and strong. So seeing an old man, and I mean an old man, was rather shocking to him. He also discovered a dying man, someone who was sick. He came across a dead man, and of course, he came across a poor man, all things that he was totally unfamiliar with. So, being fascinated by this thing that he had never been exposed to before, he wanted to know more about the topic of suffering since this was all new information. And he finally chose, after some time, to leave his wife and family to discover what this whole suffering thing was all about. Now note, Hinduism, as a part of where he was in Nepal, was definitely the norm. And he wanted to pursue their studies, but he could only encounter so many priests who only could explain so many things. He pursued philosophy, he even pursued meditation, and then finally he resorted to asceticism, meaning the physical denial of himself and his needs. He, according to the accounts, lived on just less than a handful of rice a day, to the point where he was starving to death in order to outdo the passion and the dedication that his fellow Hindus were dedicating themselves to in addressing suffering. Then, according to records, he says that the Bodhi tree, where they have a shrine dedicated to him today, he had a vision and an encounter with the divine. He understood the true nature of the universe, or what was literally enlightenment, and I guess outlined this in what we call today the Eightfold Path, that taught everything that he discovered in his path to enlightenment until he eventually died of natural causes at the age of 80. The prince's name is, and I'll make an attempt to pronounce this, but Siddhartha or Siddhartha Gautama. He lived around the 6th century BC. 563 is the most concrete date, and that's because of the work of a certain individual we'll mention in a moment. The main claims that Buddhism would make, as far as Buddhism proper, there are lots of Buddhas who would make different claims, but we'll get that in a moment as well. They would note that the universe is eternal. They would note the nature of Brahman, as God and the universe are one and the same thing. The goal is, of course, to become one with the universe, much like in Hinduism with nirvana, but in order to do this, you must follow the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Four Noble Truths are the following. First, that suffering, literally dukkha, is what's wrong with this universe. The second truth is that desire is what leads to suffering. We see that demonstrated in Hinduism as well. The third noble truth is abandoning all desire is freedom from suffering, or literally nirvana, freedom. And lastly, that abandoning desire is done through the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is a series of instructions and ideas. Having the right view, which is to adopt the Buddhist perspective on suffering in the afterlife. The right intention, which would be to adopt the Buddha's motives on removing suffering and pursuing nirvana. The right speech, which would be adopting the Buddha's standards for proper speech, not just in terms of language, but when to speak, when not to. The right action, which would be to adopt the Buddha's morals in ideal human behavior. Right livelihood, which would be to adopt the Buddha's goals in serving bodily or communal needs, not only at complete abstinence to oneself. The right effort, which would be to adopt Buddha's balance in what you do and why. The right mindfulness, which is to adopt Buddha's distinction between desire and duty. And the right concentration, his meditation habits. And, of course, when you finally achieve enlightenment, this can be done over an infinite number of lifetimes. You remove dukkha from your enduring self, your Atman, which we talked about in our Hindu study, through reincarnation, or anatta. So they do acknowledge some of the fundamental claims of Hinduism, that suffering is, of course, tied into attachment, and that, of course, reincarnation and the, I guess, end result of that journey are a thing. But it's important to note that historically and archaeologically, we know none of this. And I mean zero, as far as anything regarding this Nepali prince is concerned, because everything that we learn about him actually came from a emperor in India named Ashoka the Great. Now, I'm sure Star Wars fans, especially the Clone Wars, are probably perking up like, oh, there's a girl emperor out there? No, it was a guy. But the name Ashoka during the Mauryan dynasty, I believe, was essentially the one who converted to this belief system, and he's the one who sponsored and popularized the construction of all the shrines, all of the texts, and all of the written teachings that we know about Buddha, which, again, dated around 200 BC. Now, I'm noting with full transparency here that Ashoka was not the inventor of Buddhism, that Siddhartha Gautama was not a fictional invention of Ashoka, but it's important to note that this is how ancient history just is. When it comes to historical figures that we have absolute reasonable certainty to believe actually existed, most of the time we're going centuries before we have anything written down, because this is over 2,000 years ago of information. In Buddha's case, 2,500 years ago. But when Ashoka finally wrote all these things down, that post-dated Buddha by 300 years. And that would essentially be the same situation that Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code pretends was true of Christianity and wasn't. Christianity doesn't have this problem. But it's important to note that when you read Buddhist books, or books that are addressing Buddhism, or even books written by Buddhists that are in favor of it, the honest ones will acknowledge we don't have the words of our Lord, but we have a reasonable idea of not only the culture that he came from and what was consistent with that, and the earliest possible sources, which were, of course, 200 years before Christ. So understand that this is what they have to work with. And it's not a problem historically. But if you're encountering someone that's arguing for Buddhism and saying it has more historical validity than Christianity, this is an important place to start, because where it's coming from, the assumptions that it's making are important. Now, before we get into addressing some of the problems, the conflicts between Christianity and Buddhism, why we do acknowledge that there is a difference, Adrian, regarding your experience with Buddhists, did the history come in handy as far as understanding, noticing, or even getting around some of the problems they had with Christianity?
Well, not as much, because most Buddhists are animistic. They don't have an academic background in Buddhism. It's more cultural. There's more spirit worship, ancestral worship, and just an acknowledgement of something greater than themselves in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
But, when I spent time in Buddhist countries, the most important feature, for me anyhow, was to just undermine their stereotypes of Christians. And a lot of that did most of the work.
Yeah.
Buddhists had no problems with Jesus. They had problems with Western civilization.
Right.
But they had a hard time separating the two. So I had to go to great lengths to persuade my audience that I was not here to teach them Western civilization or Western culture. I was here simply to talk about our Creator. Now, Buddhism is non-theistic. They don't adhere to any kind of theism. But your average Buddhist, though, would have a kind of pan or panentheistic worldview based on their culture.
Yeah, meaning the universe and God, everything is God.
Yeah. Pantheism is the idea that all reality is divine. Panentheism is the idea that God dwells all living things. Very similar to the Force without the midichlorians.
and the internal conflict system, which we'll get into in a moment.
Yeah.
But the idea there is important to note. When people are concerned about, well, how am I going to get all this history together? This is for your benefit, not necessarily stuff you'll have to memorize and you get quizzed on when bringing this up. You're dealing with human beings who have a perspective that's mostly handed to them rather than pursued by them. You know, if you're dealing with the, grade A Buddhists like Sam Harris and Adam Savage and others, it's going to be the same issue. They aren't going to approach this from a spiritual or historical perspective. It's just going to be how they see things. But if you understand where it's coming from, then you can be one step ahead in not only showing, I have respect for your culture. I've learned more about the world than what happened on 1776. But even more importantly, I'm willing to say, now with Hinduism in mind, you would distance yourself from that, but you'd also adopt a worldview that came from it. And that's already a step further than most people are willing to go, because there are even Christians who will fail to understand Christianity came from Judaism. And if we read Christianity like a 21st century American instead of a first century Hebrew, we're going to miss some things, like, the whole Old Testament.
Right, yeah.
So
and the same is true with Buddhism. It was born out of rejection of Hinduism. They rejected the caste system and the Hindu Vedas. That was Buddha's big objection.
But ironically, he also adopted the view of the afterlife regarding reincarnation.
Karma and every birth. Another cardinal doctrine of Buddhism, as in Hinduism, is every birth is a rebirth.
And that the Vedas and as well the Bhagavad Gita, which we talked about in Hinduism, would affirm suffering's the issue. So what's the solution?
Yeah.
And like Hinduism, the issue is, again, to be sometimes indifferent, sometimes proactive, but it's coming from that worldview.
Yeah.
And if it's all centered around suffering rather than fellowship with God, that's the first thing you need to notice. And that's why history is important.
And that's what makes Buddhism sort of popular, because it's, in a Western context, it's less religious in the sense that a belief in the supernatural, especially for an atheist. It's very adaptable because it's about, treating your neighbors right and living a peaceful life and not being, a glutton for things.
As far as the Buddha would model that,
Yeah, and then, so that's appealing to people because it's just kind of a way of like, gosh, if I don't care about things as much, then I won't be so stressed about everything. But for the spiritualized Buddhists, they're adopting a hodgepodge of Eastern ideas. They don't even, they may call themselves a Buddhist, but they don't really understand Buddhism.
And who does? But that's the whole point. So regarding the actual problems then, moving on to the main issues that would show that beliefs have consequences, the main issue with Buddhism is their teaching on morality. And as is dealing with suffering, Hinduism's solution is just to stop caring about the problem. Buddhism would take it a step further and say, redefining the problem as non-existent is the solution. It's all in the mindset. This is first regarding the teaching of Buddha. It's the name of the book. Page 53, quote, "There is no discrimination between right and wrong, but people make a distinction for their own convenience." They build on this on page 62, saying, quote, "The people make a distinction between good and evil, but good and evil do not exist separately. Those who are following the path to enlightenment recognize no such duality," meaning it's not good and evil, or evil, it's good and evil as one and the same. "It leads them to neither praise the good, nor condemn the evil, nor to despise the good and condone the evil." So it's not about being on the light or the dark side. It's just is. I'm neutral, not just to a fault, but to a flaw.
Yeah, evil is an illusion. Evil in its essence, the subject of evil it's an illusion. It's a manufacturing.
And even more horrifyingly, so is good.
Mm-hmm.
The concept of a positive, of something that ought to be pursued, is as much a fake as an illusion, as something to be ignored and disregarded as the evil itself.
And that's what creates some of the internal contradictions within Buddhism, because one of the end goals of reaching nirvana is to shake off wrong desires. Well, how do you have a wrong desire if the word wrong is non-existent, if there's no such thing as a wrong desire?
You're basing it off the Buddha's perspective, not on plain reality.
Yeah.
And that's also very scary for people because Buddhists have loved ones Buddhists have things go on in their life where they naturally are supposed to, ought to, and do care about these things, but their religious system requires them to either turn a blind eye or to condemn themselves for it, which in itself would be a symptom of dukkha, interestingly enough, to the point where it leads to this. On the basis of morality, a Buddhist can't look at death any differently than they'd view a compliment. They can't diversify the difference between a child's murderer any more than a child's birth. They can't see a difference between a sunset and a barren wasteland of suffering and death. That's the ideal. And since there is no distinction due to the moral example of the enlightened one, the Buddha, that would then of itself be non-Buddhist. That's my dukkha talking. I'm attached. I'm interested in such a thing as, well, I should have this perspective, but I don't. And like Hinduism, again, not caring about the problem isn't a solution to it. Wherever and whether or not it's in the macro, like reincarnation, or in the micro, like enlightenment, the same is a mistake from a new angle. If I look internally and say, I just need to stop caring and I will fix the problem, that's Buddhism. If I look at the macro and say, if I just stop caring about the world around me and the suffering in it, that's the solution, that's Hinduism. But noting that this is where the dividing line is, the concept of right and wrong is where ultimately the divide is between any other worldview and Eastern thought, Buddhism, Hinduism, the rest respectively. Now again, when it comes to Buddhist teaching and the sort of things you need to be prepared for as far as talking with Buddhists, there's going to be, I guess, just the fundamentals when it comes to how do I know what someone is talking about. And this is helpful when it comes to your interpretation of the Bible, but it isn't necessarily complicated in that we do this naturally with everything else that we interact with. In order for someone to make a coherent point, and I don't mean that every sentence has to follow these rules, but if you're actually saying something, it's going to involve three things. First, you're going to give a definition. You're going to explain what you mean. Then you're going to give an illustration. You're going to provide an example of what you mean, something tangible and in real life. And then finally, an application, how this affects your life in reality. If I give an example of something, but I don't tell you what I mean, I haven't said anything. And if I tell you what I mean, but I don't give you an example or any meaningful way to apply it to your life, I've just said words. That doesn't mean anything. Sky is blue. I'm happy for you. That doesn't change my situation. And likewise, if you give an application, but you haven't told me what we're talking about, well, then we might be on an ADD vacation here. Nothing has actually been communicated. So, for example, when Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, and I'll read it here. This is Matthew chapter 5 and verse 43. Pay attention to how Jesus defines his terms, what illustration he gives to make that clear, and finally how it's applied in real life. Matthew 5:43 says, "You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he," that is your Father in heaven, "makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." So what was Jesus' definition? What was he talking about? It was being perfect. This is how you are complete, you are whole, you are right in the eyes of God. The illustration was God doing good, causing his rain, which was important for an agrarian, farmer-based society, and his sun to basically bless the just and the unjust. The evil were just as loved by God as the good. Now, note, as far as their relationship with him, that's another conversation. But God is good to everybody. So you be good to everybody, because note, if you're only good to people that are good to you, evil people, and he illustrates that through tax collectors, cultural sellouts at the time, were doing the same thing. Then comes the application. It's how he started. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. That was Jesus' coherent statement. He said, this is how you're perfect. You love everyone like I did, like God does. And then he gave an illustration. The Buddhist rhetoric is going to play on this a little bit. And they will sound, and this is important to note, like they are making a definition and an application. But the reality is all they're doing is giving an illustration and hoping you fill in the rest for them, when in reality they either haven't said anything or they're counting on you making assumptions, when in reality they haven't actually said that. So this is, again, the most common Buddhist conversation that will be had with Christians. They'll say that Jesus was a Buddha. Not a Buddhist per se, but a Buddha. And as we talked about before, Buddha or enlightened ones, just generally referring to a religious teacher, someone whose perspective on the divine and the nature of the world you respect. Now, we, of course, would agree with that in that he gave perspectives on the divine. But the question is, again, where in that sentence did we see a definition? Did you hear what a Buddha was? Was that defined? Did you hear any point of application? Like, for example, that since Jesus was a Buddha, therefore Christians should be Buddhists if they're really following a Buddha. Or did they make a point about what common teachings their Buddhas and our quote-unquote Buddha had? It was just throwing this statement out there and hoping that we would fill in the gaps. Oh, Jesus was a Buddha. Well, I think that means, and this is where the gullible person would step in, would fill in the gaps thinking that this is what the teacher was trying to say. And suddenly a Buddha is not a teacher of Buddhism and all that that involves. It's just a teacher in general. And they're hoping that you jump to that conclusion. Then we, not they, but we will apply it in that Buddhists and Christians all believe the same things. Or that Christians aren't following Jesus' true teachings because they'd end up looking more like a Buddhist rather than modern-day Christians. All of that was in the rhetoric of giving a single non-statement. And if you catch on to these things, and I mean, obviously there are obvious examples, Rajneesh and that whole debacle in the United States, he never said anything meaningful. He made a few jokes every now and again, and I'll give him credit for that, but
he even claimed to be Jesus.
Yeah, and that's another important
Jesus.
point, despite the fact Jesus never taught reincarnation. But when he put these ideas forward, he was counting on either his audiences being entirely doped out or focused on other things I won't mention in polite company in order to not examine his thoughts, or just to be so spiritually enamored with the fact our Buddha was talking that it doesn't matter what he means, it's what it means to me. And suddenly this all becomes very common for modern spirituality, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the subjectivism, the denial of truth with a capital T, not having a problem with contradictions, and so on. Basically, just
and this is where the smart person comes in, because a smart person would either look up or would already know what Buddhism is, and that Jesus is coming from a Jewish background rather than a Hindu one, right?
Think of that Forrest Gump line. He's like, I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is.
Yeah, I'm not a religious doctorate, but I know that Jesus was not Hindu. He was on the other side of the Euphrates River. Look that up for bonus points. But the point is what? Jesus taught attachment. Jesus taught there was an objective good and evil, whereas Buddhists would assume the opposite. Therefore, the fact that they taught in categories of the Eightfold Path, like views, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, that would all mean nothing if it ultimately means that enlightenment and eternal existence, what we believe, and enlightenment for them, eternal inexistence, are two entirely different destinations. If we both have the same trailhead, Jesus taught an Eightfold Path, Buddha taught an Eightfold Path, therefore Jesus is Buddha. Error here. What is the Eightfold Path leading to? One says eternal conscious relationship with a very personal and real God that is not this universe, and the other says that there is an impersonal deity that we would know as Brahman or the universe, and that, of course, is what enlightenment is, being a part of the whole, inexisting, ceasing from returning to life and conscious will. So the point is moot. If someone's going to make that comparison, they do, in fact, need to be called out on it, because that's a manipulation tactic. Another point that needs to be noted is, we've mentioned it before, but when Buddhists not only make statements, but when they also make assumptions. Because just like any other human being, when they're reading, they're not just reading the same language, they're also reading their perspective into it. And if we look at the words of Jesus, like, for example, John 17:3, this is the prayer at the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus said, "This is eternal life." So we're talking about definitions, right? "That they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." So he outlines what? A Buddhist would look at that and say, well, to know, that they may know you, that's eternal life. That would be an intellectual understanding of Jesus' teachings. And we believe that the Buddhas were sent back by the gods, or that they themselves returned from that state of near enlightenment, near nirvana, in order to aid us in our journeys. That's their perspective, right? They could read all that into it and not bat an eye. A Christian would look at that phrase, "they may know you," and emphasize what? This is a relational term, not philosophical. That it's about involving yourself, loving Jesus, not just in his teachings, but being with him consciously forever. One of these things does not belong. One of these things is not like the other, as we remember from Sesame Street, if you grew up in the United States, or maybe learned English from kids' shows. It is helpful, but I digress. So this is what we need to be prepared for, because when people make assumptions and you just throw verses out to them, you need to be able to back up with and be sensitive to the sort of things they'll assume. We've talked about this with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and how you can read the same verse, and because of what's handed to them by their organizations, they will not take it at face value, because they can't. A Buddhist is going to read the text of the Bible as well. And even if they respect, and notice, complete sincerity in that statement, you'd have no reason to doubt it. But if they approach that text with the assumption that Jesus was a Buddha, well, from their Buddhist paradigms, they're going to say, well, these teachings have to align with Buddhism. Why wouldn't they? So noting that as their cultural biases, and ones that we need to be sensitive to as well, can we say that we're being consistent with our text before calling out other people for being inconsistent with them and understanding the difference? Finishing up, this is where the majority of the challenges of Buddhism are going to come in. And this may get a little technical, but this is, again, intended for research for your benefit on a later date. If you want to revisit this, listen to it at another time, maybe more than once, or even to ask future questions about it when you have the opportunity. The main kinds of objections and hot points that if you actually are encountering a Buddhist that you need to be prepared for are mainly going to be narrowed down to these 5. Obviously, they'll take different forms, but they'll say, and this is the first and most important point, Adrian alluded to it earlier, Buddhism isn't all the Nepalese version, the Siddhartha Gautama thing. He isn't the only Buddha. There's lots of different Buddhas from lots of different cultures, and that's completely true. But there also are going to be those who will then take the step and say, just because Gautama's version of Buddhism was not compatible with Christianity doesn't mean other sects of Buddhism are compatible with Christianity. Well, here's the 7 main sects of Buddhism and their teachings regarding these details of anatta and atman and the concept of dukkha and all these other issues. Would they differ in those fundamental things, which are actually the problem? Again, forgive my attempts at pronunciation, but the definitely most common form of Buddhism is referred to as Man Asanghika, which is, again, the common stereotype, monastic, very, social version of Buddhism. They aren't always, found in robes and shaving heads and chanting with beads and so forth. But it's consistently applying every single one of the things that makes Buddhism what it is. They acknowledge that suffering is the issue. They acknowledge reincarnation. They acknowledge the ultimate goal and essence of the afterlife is inexistence rather than conscious existence, at least as a good side. The second most common is referred to as Sattvaira Vada, Again, forgive my pronunciation. But this is literally translated as the school of elders, which in the modern stereotype is where you see monastic practice very strictly applied, but also noting as well them wearing robes or not, like the first version of Buddhism, they still believe in anatta and atman, dukkha, reincarnation, nirvana, and the like, the actual issues between it and Christianity. The third most common is Mahayana, or literally big raft, which is unique in that it also teaches arhat, or the perfect disciple of the Buddha. They would, of course, emphasize pursuing the ideal, the bodhisattva, which would again be when a Buddhist, or rather when a Buddha, voluntarily foregoes nirvana for the sake of his followers so that he can set an example for people. But notice, that's the only difference in this sect. Everything else regarding what Buddhism proper would teach are still present in this sect. The fourth is very exclusive to Japan. It is known as Zen Buddhism, where they would make more of an emphasis on meditation than the other quote-unquote denominations, and they would also make an emphasis to pursue satori, or understanding. They don't necessarily communicate, they just want to comprehend. Definitely the quiet stereotype, the shrines and so forth, where they spend all day meditating and don't really interact with people, but they'll still welcome people to ring the bell and give donations charitably. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. But it's noting different words because, again, Nepalese, Indian, Sanskrit, all that kind of stuff, and Japanese, different languages. But they all carry the same meaning. It's not something that they would differ in Buddhist. These are things that all Buddhists would share. Vajrayana is based on the Hindu thunder god. It would observe a very, very different set of applications as far as the removal of dukkha through ritualistic practices, but understand what is the removal of dukkha. Even if it's rituals, it's still acknowledging an eightfold path and in mind of the Four Noble Truths. The most common and well-known adherent to this form of Buddhism, you may know his name, is the Dalai Lama. He definitely doesn't have a lot in common with Christianity either, would you note to ask him. The sixth that I have noted in my debate was Theravada, which is a very intellectual and extremely passionate study of Buddhist words and teachings. The application and definition, of course, would be self-evident that they are emphasizing the application of personal study before direct application to your behavior. But notice, what are they studying? It's still the Eightfold Path, Nirvana, Atman, Anatta, Dukkha, the rest. And lastly, Puggalavada, where, interestingly enough, this would be considered a cult or a heretical sect of Buddhism. But they make a point that your Atman, your enduring self, stays between lifetimes, that you can actually remember who you were in previous lives, before and even when you finally enter Brahman. But notice that the acknowledgement of these things, the real difference between the two, is a different view of one of all the main issues. They still acknowledge reincarnation. They still acknowledge all of these different ideas that put it at odds with Christianity. Now, again, this is a very difficult answer, but in short terms, you don't have to read Buddhism, A Concise Introduction by Houston Smith and Philip Novak. That's where I got all the names of these sects from. But it's noting this point, because Buddhism's variety of application throughout history still has a core center of beliefs that they all had in common, the people that are going to make this objection, the people who are going to say, well, you know, that's just that version. There are Buddhist groups that are compatible with Christianity. All you have to do is ask where and when. Give yourself specifics. And if one of these comes up or another group, I guarantee you it's either going to be a modern innovation or it's not Buddhism at all. But then that then being said, there's others who will make it, and this is what you're going to probably run into if you're in the more historically minded group. Jesus actually went to India and taught Buddhism, but, as is always the way of the internet, the church censored it. You see, there's hidden parts of the Bible that actually teach Buddhism, and that was removed by the Catholic Church. You get the idea. Well, obviously, just like when an atheist would say the Bible has changed the Council of Nicaea, when Muslims will say it was all elaborate conspiracy, and they preach the gospel of Sneeko and so forth, all you have to do is ask where and when. And if they give you a straight answer, to look it up, because the only and the closest affiliation with Buddhism, and of course its origins, would be in India and the Church of Thomas. We talked a bit about this in regards to Hinduism in our previous session, but the Church of India, or the Church of Thomas, actually has its roots in the Syriac tradition, and they've mainly been independent from the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic Church, especially, and a long time before the Protestant Reformation. We also need to note as well that the Catholics had no love for the Church of Thomas. There were times where they allowed the Jesuits safe passage through their lands, but there was also a little incident where the Inquisition came through and persecuted the Church of Thomas for not being Catholic enough. The Portuguese are definitely a tough crowd. So when we ask the question, okay, so here's one very select and isolated group of Christianity exclusive to India and with ties to the Syriac tradition, which is very much limited to the Middle East, we then ask the question, so where and when could you say that they fundamentally changed all their doctrine by order of the Pope, when all you can prove is that a group of Catholic missionaries passed through there at one time and were given free use of their docks for trade? It's a bit of a leap, right? And if you're clued in on the history as well, it would be just as weird for me to say, well, obviously Hinduism is a Christian cult because, Thomas went to India. So obviously all of India converted to Christianity. Then the Hindus came in later and corrupted Christianity into what you read today. Well, you'd laugh that out of the room. You'd say Hinduism has archaeological and written documents a long time before Thomas, and you can't just say because one Christian interacted with the nation and even gained a following that suddenly that means that the entire belief system of our culture and society was revised. Now you know how we feel, because why would you then say that Christianity was wholeheartedly corrupted by Roman Catholics when A, you can't prove that, and B, their only interactions were brief at best and tepid at worst, especially hostile once we get to the 1600s, or 1500s, 16th century. This is where we then get into more productive conversations. And Adrian, I'd love to throw this out to you. When people say, I'd rather pay off my debts through karma, I like the Buddha's way, rather than Jesus suffering for me. Some might even throw in unjustly suffering for me, like Sam Harris and Adam Savage. It's unfair for Jesus to pay my debts. I'd rather go through the process of reincarnation because I like that system more. What would you say to that?
What would I say? Well, first you would have to define what that person means by karma. And can you really pay it off? I mean, if every birth is a rebirth, do you have any evidence whatsoever that you will actually reach the endless sea of rebirths and actually achieve nirvana or moksha or whatever it is that you're looking for? How do you know that you'll achieve that?
I'm trusting the Buddha.
Because, but you don't know if he ever achieved it.
Yep. That's the issue. It's
so
just a
no one's
perspective.
been there. Whereas with Jesus, you have concrete a resurrection. You have concrete, been there, done that. I'm speaking from first hand. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I go to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house, there are many mansions. And so you have a guarantee, a promise of something real, concrete.
Not that Jesus had a perspective on the afterlife that achieved enlightenment on the cross. It was, I'm going to die and I'm going to come back to show this is the nature of the afterlife, a conscious existence with or apart from God.
It's like that blind man illustration or blindfold illustration where everyone's has a hand on the elephant and they're trying to describe what they see. Buddha's just another blind guy. He just happens to have a different part of the elephant that everyone's like, oh, wow. His perspective on reality is interesting. He's describing what sounds like a trunk. No one has ever described a trunk before.
Meanwhile, it's still an elephant.
Jesus is not blind and has actually got a perspective of the whole thing.
Yeah, he's the one telling the parable, right?
And then there's the moral question, too. Most atheists would, well, maybe not. I shouldn't say that. Someone like Sam Harris would agree. I think he's a moral realist.
Yeah.
The idea that morality is objective and discoverable.
But he bases it off of human flourishing rather than a conscious will.
Yeah. Whereas, and so that's what makes defining morality very difficult.
Yeah.
So when you say karma, well, if evil is an illusion, wrongdoing's an illusion, how do you define shaking off wrong desires?
How do you know what to get rid of?
Yeah, how do you know that maybe the guy who's abusing his wife will reincarnate as an abused wife? That's assuming that there's something wrong with wife abusing. Maybe in some weird, alternate version of the universe, maybe wife abuse is a good thing, and you're gonna uplift that woman to a higher caste, even though they reject the caste system, a higher birth because of what they had to endure.
Yeah, this is where I hope that the Sikhs are around, because there was a Hindu group that converted a new religion just to oppose wife beating in Islam, among other things, granted.
Yeah.
But it's just noting that point. Hindus can't function like this, and even a philosophy that came out of it, the solution is just another problem.
Yeah. So that would be the first thing the couple things I would do is, first, well, morality, how you define it. You can't. I can. Two, where are you going? No one's ever been back to tell us about it. Christianity, yes, someone's been back to tell us about it. And so there's no, and then truth. How every time someone tries to hammer the law of non-contradiction, they end up getting hammered by it.
Yeah.
So you can't describe what you're describing with this philosophy without actually affirming what you're opposing.
And saying, well, you don't understand it, then why are we talking
Yeah.
about it? Because apparently you don't either.
Yeah, so those are some of the things that I would talk about when someone says, "Well, I'd rather just," but there's also an element of pride there.
Yeah.
I'd rather, like the idea of purgatory. I was recently studying that and seeing where it came from and how it developed, as an accretion in Christian history, especially the Roman Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that is the perfect example in the West of how human pride creeps in and goes, "No, there has to be a way that I can attain it myself. There has to be a way where I can actually prove myself rather than relying on God's unmerited favor. I have to be able to do it. I've got to be able to pull myself by the bootstraps." This is so contrary to human pride. The Christian message is, that is. The Christian message is so abhorrent to human pride that we have to invent religions to come up with simpler ways to earn it on my own.
Whereas in the gospel, it's either taking sin as seriously as it ought to be, or undermining God's goodness and his ability to judge us justly. Mm-hmm. And it's either going to be done on the cross or not, but that's the point. This is a fantastic question because it gives us a layup to the gospel, and that's what every conversation should lead to.
Yeah, and in a Buddhist life, there is no wrong life.
Yeah.
I mean, you could be a drug addict, strung out on the gutter, and be a Buddhist, and be totally consistent.
Yeah, and you can't say that that's wrong, because that'd just be a symptom of your dukkha. Another one that you're going to hear, this is more in the history-minded one. Jesus was actually a myth that was copied from Siddhartha Gautama. They claim that he was both born of a virgin, that wise men were present at his birth, they were prophesied to save their nation, they had 12 disciples, they were buried in a rich man's tomb, they both rose from the dead, that the only difference is that Buddha's story was 600 years earlier, and the Jews who wrote the Old Testament had contact with India during their exile in Babylon during his lifetime and then copied their religion. Well, the response is, again, according to actual Buddhist sources, they're lying. And you can't even say they're just wrong or misled. No one who would be able to string that information together could do so and not actually have access to the truth and say the opposite. First of all, the most prominent Buddha was born to a woman named Maya Devi on the 8th day of the 4th lunar calendar in Nepal, and that was not her first child. So virgin birth is out. Second, a sage predicted that his birth would involve a choice, that he would become either a great political leader or a great spiritual leader. And this is, by the way, not according to primary Buddhist sources. This is according to what we have from Ashoka. That's important. Third, the reason he was isolated was because his father wanted him to be a great political leader, to, of course, keep up the family business of a dynasty. He made him live within luxury in his palace walls in order to keep him from any form of suffering, and it backfired. Fourth, he was exposed to, as we said before, a poor man, a starving man, a dead man, and a sick man, which he had never seen before. That's not a miracle. That's just being exposed to reality. No mention of the number of disciples that he had. That's false. His obsession with the concept of suffering and studying Hindu philosophy, I don't think that has a lot in common with Jesus. His enlightenment and laying out of Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Paths were a result of him starving himself to death under a tree, not being nailed to it. And finally, his death of natural causes is not a crucifixion. He did not die at 33. He died around his 80s. And of course, Jesus passed on more than just his teachings. He passed on who he literally was. If you want to, again, read up more on this, the Edicts of Asoka, which are dated 300 years after Buddha's death, Maya Devi's shrine in Lumbini, which is, again, the tree that the legend Asoka wrote reports about her giving birth next to, and he chose to build a shrine to it. That includes some of this story. And you can also read the traditions of Howie Chin-nan. That's, of course, one of the more comprehensive accounts of his life. Now, regarding the Old Testament aspect of things, if you claim copying, you can't say Buddhism existed and Judaism existed, therefore Judaism copied everything they believed from Buddhism. Buddha was alive when ethnic Hebrews were nearby, but Babylon isn't India or Nepal for that matter. There's a huge difference between being near the Euphrates River and crossing it and the entire country of India in order to perform a apparently one-sided exchange of cultures and beliefs, given everything we know about Judaism during the time period they were living in as well as today. They aren't known for being adaptable in their beliefs. It's also noted as well that during Asoka's lifetime, we have complete copies of the Old Testament through the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what Buddhism are you referring to and comparing it to Judaism when the former doesn't even have anything to prove that it was being taught that way at this time? Notice I'm not saying it didn't exist, I'm saying taught that way. The only way someone could take that claim seriously is if they knew nothing about the Bible, the Buddha, and the continent of Asia, which would then just bring us to the last point and saying, well, I approve of your path to God. Why don't you grant me the same respect? As we've been talking about, because truth matters. Mm-hmm. One of us can be right, both of us can be wrong, but we can't both be right. Yeah. There's either a conscious existence after this one or there isn't. But if Jesus put his money where his mouth was, he didn't just come up with a good idea, I think that deeds speak louder than words. And words certainly are more comprehensive than just ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks, Sean. Thanks for all the research and time you put into these Apologetic Mondays. We'll be back tomorrow with our regular scheduled programming. And until next Monday, we'll see you then. God bless you.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona. Your questions.
Apologetics Monday.